It's hard to believe that a decision allowing the use of 2 British military bases on the other side of the globe could cause electricity prices in Berlin to soar, inflation in Paris to return, refugees to flood into Italy, and NATO to fall into a divisive crisis. Does it sound like an unbelievable domino effect? Perhaps. But this is precisely what has analysts deeply concerned following Britain's decision to allow the US to use its bases in the conflict with Iran. A war may begin in the Middle East, but its recoil is striking back at the very heart of Europe. Could Britain's military intervention in the Middle Eastern conflict become the spark that ignites a larger crisis? Even the collapse of Europe? To find the answer, we must return to the starting point, a decision London cautiously framed as a limited defensive action. But the rest of Europe hears a very different message, that like it or not, the continent has already stepped 1 foot into this crisis. Perhaps we have become too accustomed to Europe as an impregnable fortress, a place where Middle Eastern sandstorms are just dinner-time news. But by the end of February 2026, when Operation Epic Fury erupted, that dream seemed to have shattered. When the war between the US, Israel, and Iran broke out, London initially tried to maintain a distance. The British government made it very clear: Britain will not participate in the initial attack. No bombs, no campaign, no regime change from above. A very cautious way of speaking. But then the reality on the battlefield changed faster than words. Retaliatory attacks began to spread throughout the Gulf region. A drone fell near the RAF Akrotiri base in Cyprus, just a few hundred meters from the area where British personnel are located. And so London changed its stance. The US is allowed to use British bases to attack Iranian missile launches, with the purpose described as specific and limited defense. Legally, this may be completely justified, but in geopolitics, sometimes what seems reasonable on paper sounds very different in reality. Because let's try looking at it from an outside perspective. If a military base is used to launch bombers into your territory, would you consider that country neutral? That's why many observers say, you can call this defense. But for Iran, and perhaps for many Europeans, the signal sounds like, we are at war. And so a strange thing happened. A war was launched in the Middle East, suddenly starting to pull invisible strings towards Europe. British bases in Cyprus, military assets in Bahrain, the maritime routes where European trade passes through every day. All of a sudden, they became points on the strategic map. What worries many Europeans is not just this decision itself, but the speed of the slide. 1 week ago, Europe was the audience. A week later, Europe seems to be standing right at the edge of the stage. History has witnessed similar slips. In 1914, many countries also thought they were only participating in limited support. But war has a peculiar habit. It rarely stops where people intend. Of course, no one is saying that Europe is entering into a full-scale war. But sometimes, it is the smallest steps that open the longest paths. An analyst once said, "In modern warfare, defense often means we shoot first, so we don't have to shoot later." It sounds a bit ironic, but it's also worth pondering. So, is London's decision merely a reasonable defensive action? Or is it the first step in a chain reaction that Europe will find hard to control? What do you think? If a country allows its base to be used to attack another country, is that country really still neutral in the conflict? Please share your perspective in the comments. I would love to hear your perspective on this story. And if you are interested in analyses like this about the future of Europe, consider subscribing to the channel. That helps us continue to delve into the stories that the press often just skims over. Because this decision might just be the first wave. In the next part, we will look at something much more concerning. This war seems to be getting closer to Europe than we think. For many years, Europe has been accustomed to a rather pleasant feeling. The world's tremors usually occur elsewhere. The Middle East, Africa, or distant regions on the map. Europeans see them on the evening news, discuss them for a few days, and then life returns to normal. But 2026 seems to be shaking that psychological habit. Just a few days after tensions flared up in the Middle East, a minor incident caused many people in Brussels to look at the map again. A drone crashed near the British airbase in Cyprus. No significant damage, no casualties. But in geopolitics, sometimes symbolism is more important than material consequences. Cyprus is not just a tourist island. It is a member of the European Union and also hosts important British military bases. When such an incident occurs there, even if minor, it is enough to make many people question, if these kinds of signals continue to appear, where is the boundary between a regional crisis and a European issue? The fact is that Europe is not at all outside this region. Hundreds of thousands of European citizens are living and working in the Gulf region. Specifically, the UK has around 300,000 citizens in the region. Important trade and energy routes of Europe pass through here every day. When interests are close, risks are also close. In that context, some European countries began to adjust their positions. France has deployed the Charles de Gaulle aircraft carrier to the Mediterranean, a move described as aimed at protecting national interests and stabilizing the region. This is a reasonable defensive move. But if we look at the bigger picture, the situation is somewhat ironic. Europe has been talking about strategic autonomy for many years. But whenever a crisis arises, European forces have to move thousands of kilometers outside the continent to protect their own interests. Sometimes it feels like a homeowner has to step out onto the street to keep an eye on the door. Some economists have half-jokingly said that Europe is very good at talking about global stability, as long as the instability happens elsewhere. But this time, the instability seems to be getting a little closer, starting with small signs: a drone going off course, a base raising its alert level, an important transport route starting to feel the strain. The seemingly small details, but enough to make policymakers start looking back at the map and wondering whether Europe is truly outside this story. So, in your opinion, are such signals merely temporary ripples of a distant crisis, or are they signs that global upheavals are getting closer to Europe? Please share your thoughts in the comments, as sometimes different perspectives help us understand the bigger picture better. Because what worries many Europeans the most may not be these scattered security signals, but rather what is quietly creeping into daily life: energy prices and the cost of living. And that is the next wave of the story. History often has a rather interesting way of reminding us that today's world is like an electrical system. You touch one point, and the current can run through the entire network. This time, that current could run through energy prices. There is a narrow passage between Iran and the Arabian Peninsula that most Europeans rarely think about: the Strait of Hormuz. Not too large on the map, but about 20% of the world's oil and liquefied gas passes through this place every day. When that region becomes tense, the energy market often reacts very quickly. In just a few days, Brent crude oil prices jumped from around $70 to over $82 per barrel. Gas prices in Europe increased by about 28%. These numbers sound like economic news. But for an ordinary family in Manchester, Milan, or Munich, it is not a graph. It is next month's electricity bill. It's the price of gas when filling up the car. It's the price of bread in the supermarket. There are estimates suggesting that the energy bill for a European household could increase by around £500 per year if the situation of tension persists. And this is happening at a rather sensitive time. Europe has not yet fully recovered from the energy shock of 2022. Many families still remember the feeling of opening their winter electricity bills and wondering whether to turn on the heater for another hour. Central banks are also in quite a difficult situation. If they raise interest rates to control inflation, the economy may slow down. But if nothing is done, prices may continue to rise. In economics, there is an old term for this situation: stagflation. High inflation accompanies low growth. Older Europeans might still remember the 1970s, when the oil shock forced the entire continent to change its way of life. The streets were darker in the evening, smaller cars, and a general feeling that the economy is no longer as stable as before. What makes many people feel uneasy this time is not the events in the Middle East themselves, but rather the way they quickly seep into daily life. A distant crisis suddenly becomes an uninvited guest at the family dinner table. Many people say that in a globalized world, an event in the Middle East can determine the price of bread in Madrid. Sounds like a joke, but sometimes it is quite close to the truth. So, are these fluctuations in the energy sector just a short-term wave? Or could they become a long-term pressure on the European economy? And if the cost of living continues to rise, how will the political mood in Europe change? Please share your thoughts in the comments section. Different perspectives often help us understand the bigger picture better. And if you want to continue following in-depth analyses of the economic and geopolitical factors affecting European life, consider subscribing to the channel, because energy and inflation might just be part of the story. While Europeans are facing increasingly high living costs, another issue is gradually emerging. That is, the division within Europe itself. European history has a rather strange rule. When everything is stable, this continent often talks about unity. But every time the world starts to shake, the story changes, and this time is no different. The tensions in the Middle East not only put pressure on energy markets and trade routes, but also inadvertently highlight a rather sensitive truth. Europe does not always see the world in the same way. In recent weeks, a familiar structure has begun to emerge. Three major powers, the UK, France, and Germany, are coordinating quite closely to align their responses. In diplomatic circles, this group is often referred to as E3. This is not surprising. These three countries have long played a central role in many of Europe's foreign affairs, but the rest of the continent does not see everything in the same way. Spain is a clear example. Madrid has refused to allow the use of the Morón and Rota bases for activities related to the current crisis. Their stance is quite simple. The deeper the involvement, the greater the risk, especially for countries located near the Mediterranean. And so, a familiar line of division in Europe reappears. In Northern and Central Europe, some countries lean towards a traditional approach of security and alliances. Meanwhile, many Southern European countries, which are geographically closer to the Middle East, appear to be more cautious, not because they care less about regional stability. On the contrary, it is precisely because they understand very well that each tremor in the Middle East often reaches their shores first. Interestingly, all parties are talking about the same goal: stability. But the path to achieving stability is different. Some governments believe that close coordination with traditional partners is necessary to maintain regional balance. Other governments believe that the wisest course is to keep as much distance as possible. As a result, Europe is still reacting, but reacting in many different directions. And that reveals a familiar paradox of the European Union. The EU can be very unified when it comes to trade, technical standards, or food regulations. But when the story shifts to security and geopolitics, countries often revert to their old instincts, national interests first. An observer once wryly remarked that Europe is like a large choir. When the song is easy, everyone sings in harmony. But when the music becomes difficult, each person starts to keep their own rhythm. Perhaps that is what is happening right now. Is this difference just a natural part of European democracy, or is it a sign that this continent is increasingly finding it hard to reach a consensus as the world becomes more unstable? Please share your thoughts in the comments section. Different perspectives often help us see the bigger picture behind diplomatic statements. And if you enjoy calm yet straightforward analyses about Europe's future, you might consider subscribing to the channel to continue following. Because while Europe is debating its direction, another question is emerging. Amidst the continent's busy internal divisions, is someone quietly benefiting from that distraction? When discussing tensions in the Middle East, most of the conversation often revolves around one question: what will happen next in that region? But sometimes the more important question lies elsewhere, not in the desert or distant maritime routes, but in the consequences that spread outward. And one of the most notable consequences could be in Eastern Europe. First of all, there is the energy story. High oil prices are always unwelcome news for European economies that rely on imports. But for the major energy exporting countries, the picture is different. Russia, for example, remains one of the world's major oil and gas exporters. When energy prices rise, Moscow's budget often benefits. Some analysts estimate that if the situation at major energy transport routes continues, oil prices could very well approach or exceed the $0 per barrel mark. When that happens, tens of billions of dollars could flow into Russia's energy revenue. Meanwhile, many European economies are facing higher inflation and increased cost of living pressures. But energy is only part of the story. The rest involves strategic attention. In international politics, attention is also a form of resource. When a major crisis arises, governments, the media, and policy resources are often drawn to it. And that means other issues sometimes receive less attention. Currently, Europe is still facing a major security challenge in the East. But as the upheavals in the Middle East capture the attention of many Western capitals, several observers are beginning to wonder whether this distraction will create strategic vacuums. History shows that great powers are often very sensitive to such moments. When an opponent is drawn into multiple issues at once, the balance of power can sometimes shift in very subtle ways. It is noteworthy that in this scenario, Russia doesn't even need to do anything too dramatic. As long as energy prices rise and Western attention is diverted, Moscow can benefit from the situation. So, in your opinion, how much can the current upheavals change the global balance of power? Is Europe capable of focusing on multiple challenges at once? Or could this dispersion make the continent more fragile? After everything we've just discussed, the biggest question still seems to hang in the air. Are all these upheavals really enough to make Europe collapse? If we look at the current picture, three weaknesses are quite apparent. First is energy. For many years, Europe has depended on external supply routes. When those supply lines became strained, the entire continent immediately felt the pressure through electricity bills, gas prices, and living costs. Secondly, there is political division. As we have seen, even in sensitive times, European countries still view the world from different perspectives. This is not always a bad thing, but it makes finding a common path more difficult. And thirdly, there is the security issue. After several decades of relative peace, much of Europe's security structure still relies heavily on partners outside the continent. As the world becomes more complex, the question of Europe's strategic autonomy begins to resurface. When these three factors, energy, politics, and security, appear simultaneously, the system can become more fragile than it seems. History once had a moment quite like that. In 1956, the Suez Crisis did not destroy Britain, but it marked a major turning point. For the first time, London realized that the old world order had changed. Some analysts today are questioning whether Europe is entering a similar moment, not an immediate collapse, but a phase in which the geopolitical role of this continent is gradually changing. Can this continent adapt to an increasingly unstable world and regain its unity? Or are we witnessing the first signs of a historical turning point? What do you think about this? Is Europe still capable of maintaining its position in the changing global order? Or are the current upheavals just the beginning of a larger story? Please share your thoughts in the comments section. Such discussions often help us see more clearly what is happening behind the news headlines. And if you are interested in deep and calm analyses of Europe's future, you might consider subscribing to the channel to continue following. Because in history, major changes rarely begin with a thunderclap. Sometimes, they just start with a very small crack in the foundation. When looking back at the entire story, perhaps the most thought-provoking aspect is not a single event, not a military decision, not a base being used, and it's not a tension in the Middle East either. What is more concerning is the chain reaction it could trigger. A military decision can trigger new security signals. Those signals could impact the energy market. Energy prices, in turn, affect the economy. The economy affects politics. And politics is often where the cracks in a system begin to show most clearly. Europe has overcome many crises: financial crisis, public debt crisis, energy crisis. And each time, this continent finds a way to adapt. But today's world seems more complex than before. Crises no longer appear in isolation. They often come at the same time, overlapping, creating new pressures on systems that are already quite fragile. Are the current upheavals just a familiar cycle of geopolitics, and everything will gradually stabilize again? Or are we witnessing the first signs of a larger shift in Europe's position on the world map? If you find this video useful and want to continue following in-depth analyses of the economy, geopolitics, and the future of Europe, please like, share the video, and subscribe to the channel. That really helps the channel gain more motivation to continue producing in-depth research and analysis content like this. This video is made for the purpose of analyzing and discussing geopolitical and economic trends based on publicly available information from various sources. The content is not intended to attack any country, organization, or individual. Some statements in the video are analytical and speculative based on the current context, and the actual situation may change over time. Viewers should consult additional sources of information to gain a more comprehensive perspective.